قد عظمت فللأمجاد بانيها ومن يسعى إلى العليا سيدركها بما فيها ويبني مجده جدلا فروح الفذ يعليها ليصبح همة تروي عن العليا مغاني.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. وملونجا tubaku Salam TV amanya Ibrahim Bagalalo Ibrahmatic era nga watchman nti Sunday tubeera wano buli lunaku Sunday saa 8 paka saa 9 nga tukutuusako biki events ki eziriwo ezibadde mu bintu by'abavubuka era olunaku olwaleero twabaddeko Makerere ne tubanga tukutuusako kye bayise 3rd Annual Quran Conference ngetegekeddwa bannaffe aba Froqan nga wokimanyi buli mwaka bateekeka ku conference eno era nga begatta wamu ne bannaffe aba MSAU Muslim Students Association of Uganda. So tugenda kulaga byonna ebyabaddewo gwe tova ku Salam TV gwali ku Afro Mobile nagobera emikutu gyaffe gyonna beerako tukulaga ebiki ebyabaddewo tovaawo.
وقال الذين كفروا لا تسمعوا لهذا القرآن والغوا فيه لعلكم تغلبون فلنذيقن الذين كفروا عذابا شديدا ولنجزينهم أسوأ الذي كانوا يعملون ذلك جزاء أعداء الله النار لهم فيها دار الخلد جزاء بما كانوا بآياتنا يجحدون وقال الذين كفروا ربنا أرنا الذين أضلانا من الجن ربنا أرنا الذين أضلانا من الجن والإنس نجعلهما تحت أقدامنا ليكونا من الأسفلين إن الذين قالوا ربنا الله ثم استقاموا تتنزل عليهم الملائكة ألا تخافوا ولا تحزنوا تتنزل عليهم الملائكة ألا تخافوا ولا تحزنوا وأبشروا بالجنة التي كنتم توعدون نحن أولياؤكم في الحياة الدنيا وفي الآخرة ولكم فيها ما تشتهي أنفسكم ولكم فيها ما تدعون نزلا من غفور رحيم ومن أحسن قولا ممن دعا إلى الله وعمل صالحا وقال إنني من المسلمين ولا تستوي الحسنة ولا السيئة ادفع بالتي هي أحسن فإذا الذي بينك وبينه عداوة كأنه ولي حميم وما يلقاها إلا الذين صبروا وما يلقاها إلا ذو حظ عظيم وإما ينزغنك من الشيطان نزغ فاستعذ بالله إنه هو السميع العليم ومن آياته الليل والنهار والشمس والقمر لا تسجدوا للشمس ولا للقمر واسجدوا لله الذي خلقهن إن كنتم إياه تعبدون فإن استكبروا فالذين عند ربك يسبحون له بالليل والنهار وهم لا يسأمون.
I'll speak about the making of Islamophobic racism in the world today. Anti-immigrant Islamophobic racism. And the making of this Islamophobic racism in Western societies, in Western countries, in the West, but also in the world generally. And I will begin with the concept of the West. What is the West? What are the assumptions on which the concept of the West is founded? Is it a natural phenomenon, or is it historically produced? At what point do certain societies begin to identify as the West? And what does this self-identification as the West mean with regard to the relations between the West and other parts of the world? What does this concept of the West illuminate? What does it allow us to see? What does it tell us? And what does it obscure? What does it try to hide from us? So let me begin with what we are familiar with and proceed to what we may not be familiar with. And allow me to begin with the concept of Uganda. We all know that the concept of Uganda, and indeed the concrete reality that we know as Uganda, is a very recent creation. If you woke up your grandfather, if your grandmother returned from the dead, grandmother who died 150 years ago, she would have no clue whatsoever on what Uganda is. Uganda never existed 150 years ago. Yet we are here claiming very proudly to be Ugandans, asserting that we are Ugandans. So Uganda has become our lived reality, and it has become so ingrained in our blood that we cannot imagine a moment in time when this phenomenon called Uganda never existed. We accuse others of not being true Ugandans and even expel them from Uganda. We proudly represent Uganda in international tournaments. Some of you are even willing to fight and die for Uganda. Subhanallah. But have we ever paused and asked ourselves where this thing called Uganda came from? Whose idea was it to create Uganda as a distinct form of human political association? What are the assumptions behind the formation of Uganda as a distinct human political association? And most importantly, whose assumptions were these? Whose assumptions were these? if we were to interrogate these assumptions, would we be able to imagine another form of political association that is different from Uganda? So if we pose such questions, we realize that this thing called Uganda is a very artificial, very superficial, and indeed very recent invention. A very recent invention that is founded on someone's concept, specifically the colonizer's concept of the meaning of human association, of the meaning of human political association. Another example, the same would apply to the concept of sub-Saharan Africa. Did the people of Africa ever think of themselves in terms of Africans below the Sahara or above the Sahara? Who invented this categorization of Africans into such closed units? And whose assumptions does this categorization reflect? And is this categorization an innocent one? This categorization of Africans into sub-Saharan Africans and Africans above the Sahara, is it an innocent categorization? Or is it intended to serve certain political purposes? We can ask the same questions with regard to other categories like Africa. Today we talk about African indigenous knowledge, African indigenous religions, African history, etc. At what moment did the different societies constituting what we call Africa today come to be identified collectively as Africans? If the concept of Africa has existed for very long, has it always meant the same thing it is considered to mean today? Or has its meaning been changing? And if its meaning has been changing, what is the political implications of that change? Should we continue to accept such categories, such realities, such historical realities as Uganda, sub-Saharan Africa, Africa? Should we continue to accept such realities and by implication the assumptions behind them? Or should we imagine new categories, new ways of organizing ourselves politically? Should we rethink them? So with such questions in mind, let me come to the category, the West. The West, like Uganda, like sub-Saharan Africa, etc., is a recent modern concept that is deployed generally to mean the peoples, the cultures, the ideas of Western Europe and the settler colonial extensions. There are settler colonial extensions in North America and everywhere. So in the past few centuries, these societies, or at least significant parts of them, were made to believe that they were a homogeneous and distinct social culture formation that has existed as such from time immemorial, from ancient Greece to ancient Rome, to medieval Europe, to the Protestant Reformation, to the Enlightenment, to the era of capitalism, liberalism, the nation state, and so on. The West, or at least the dominant representation of the West, considers itself the natural heirs and indeed the culmination of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, with inspiration from the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition. So in one sentence, the West, and especially the dominant representation of the West, purports to have existed as a distinct species since the creation of time, or since time immemorial. However, there is completely no evidence to suggest that there ever existed such an allegedly homogeneous and distinct entity called the West, or any idea of such an entity until very recently, until in very recent centuries. Historical evidence indicates that the ancient Greeks understood themselves as part of the world that we know today as the Mediterranean region, which includes parts of Africa, parts of Asia, parts of Europe. They were never Westerners. The Greeks were never Westerners, or any other ancient society. They were never Westerners, because the West never existed. Second, the concept of Judeo-Christian tradition has been found to have no historical basis whatsoever, because it presupposes that the Jews and the Christians have always existed as one people, as one tradition, or as sister traditions. But we know very well from history that the Jews were rooted more in the Muslim world than in Christian territories until very recently. The Jews identified more with Islam than with Christianity until very recently. In fact, the Jews who were persecuted in the lands of Christianity fled and found refuge in the lands of Islam. Not simply the Jews, but also dissident Christians. Christians who never conformed to the dominant interpretation of Christianity. They were persecuted, and many of them fled and found refuge in the house of Islam. So the concept of Judeo-Christian tradition is also a very recent modern invention. So the ancient world was so much interconnected, and we cannot conceptualize it in such narrowly compartmentalized terms, compartmentalized socio-cultural domains that neatly culminate in the modern political demarcations, such as the West. The notion of the West is founded on several racist assumptions, and I will discuss a few of them. Number one, it assumes that the world has always been divided into the West and the East, each with its own biological and cultural characteristics that determined its fate. Second, the notion of the West assumes that the West progressed or developed, if you like, because it was driven by reason and science, while the East stagnated because it was driven by religion and tradition. Indeed, 19th century and even 20th century Western thought entertains a radical distinction between reason and religion, between science and tradition, between progress and stagnation. That to be religious means to denounce reason. To embrace science means to denounce tradition, and that there is no meeting point between the two. There is no meeting point between religion and reason. There is no meeting point between tradition and science. You are either pro-science or pro-tradition. You are either pro-progress or pro-stagnation, pro-reason or pro-religion. So the West allegedly progressed because it overcame religion, which religion supposedly hinders the use of reason. And the East supposedly remained stagnant or underdeveloped or backward because it failed to overcome religion and tradition. It failed to secularize. In other words, The West progressed because of what it is, a reason-driven civilization that determines its own destiny. That reason allows you to make your own future. Tradition or religion ties you back to tradition. You do things according to custom, according to the ways in which they have always been done, as opposed to forging your own future.
قد عظمت فللأمجاد بانيها ومن يسعى إلى العليا سيدركها بما فيها ويبني مجده جذلا فروح الفذ يعليها ليصبح همة تروي عن العليا